Hello, my dear grandchildren. This is Grandpa. Of course, you know that. But, I don't get to see you anymore due to numerous problems, but Grandpa loves you very much. And I'd always thought that as a grandpa, I'd get to read you stories and have you sit at my feet. And doesn't look like that's going to happen. So I'm going to send it to you by video. That way, everybody feels okay. Um, I wanted to tell you a story. When I was 16 years old, I had a friend named Billy Wade. We were very good friends. And one day, Billy had a cousin that was going to college at Norman, Oklahoma, out at Oklahoma University. So Grandpa and Billy and I drove out there to the university to meet his friends, and we sat up in the dorm room and visited and had a nice visit. And while I was there, I found a paperback book laying on the floor. And the guy said he had already read it and I could have it. So I took the book and read it. And turned out it was a really wonderful book. It's a book called The Werewolf. Now, there's been many stories and many books about werewolves, but this one's a very old one. It was written by a female author who, back in that day and time, they did not have a lot of female authors uh, that were being published necessarily. They had Mary Shelley, who was a contemporary, but this woman's name was Clemance Housman. And I really enjoyed this book very much. I was only 16, but I lost the book through the year, to some time or other there afterwards, and never found it. And for 50 years, I searched for that book. Every time I got a chance, I thought I had a lead on where it might be. I searched for it. I asked librarians to find it. Well, nobody could find the book for me. Well, with the modern advent of technology, I found the book. And I ordered the book. There's only, I think, one source on Amazon where you can get it, but Grandpa ordered the book. This is the book. It's called The Werewolf by Clemance Housman. And I'm going to read it to you. Okay. The Werewolf. The great farm hall was ablaze with the firelight and noise with laughter, talk, and many sounding work. None could be idle but the very young and the very old. Little Rawl, who was hugging a puppy, and old Trella, whose palsied hands fumbled over her knitting. The early evening had closed in, and the farm servants, come from their outdoor work, had assembled in the ample hall, which gave space for a score or more of workers. Several of the men were engaged in carving, and to these were yielded the best place and light. Others made or repaired fishing tackle and harness, and a great seine had occupied 3 pairs of hands. Of the women, most were sorting and mixing eider feather and chopping straw to add to it. Looms were there, though not in present use, but 3 wheels whirred immuously, and the finest and swiftest thread of the 3 ran between the fingers of the house mistress. Near her were some children, busy too, plaiting wicks for candles and lamps. Each group of worker had a lamp in his center, and those farthest from the fire had live heat from 2 braziers filled with glowing wood embers, replenished now and again from the generous hearth. But the flicker of the great fire was manifest to remotest corners and prevailed upon the limits of the weaker lights. Little Rawl grew tired of his puppy. He dropped it incontentedly and made an onslaught on Tyre, the old wolfhound, who basked dozing, whimpering, and twitching in his hunting dreams. Prone went Rawl beside Tyre, his young arms around the shaggy neck, his curls against the black jowl. Tyre gave a perfunctory lick and stretched with a sleepy sigh. Rawl growled and rolled and shoved invitingly, but could only gain from the old dog placid tolerations and a half observant blink. Take that, then, said Rawl indignantly at the ignoring of his advances, and sent the puppy sprawling against the dignity that disdained him as playmate. The dog took no notice, and the child wandered off to find amusement elsewhere. The basket of white eider feathers caught his eye far off in a distant corner. He slipped under the table and crept along on all fours, the ordinary commonplace custom of walking down a room upright not being to his fancy. When close to the women, he lay still for a moment, watching, and his elbows on the floor and his chin on his palms. One of the women, seeing him, nodded and smiled. Presently crept out behind her skirts and passed, hardly noticed, from one to another until he found opportunity to possess himself of a large handful of feathers. With these he traversed the length of the room under the table again and emerged near the spinners. At the feet of the youngest he curled himself round, sheltered by her knees from the observation of the others, and disarmed her of interference by secretly displaying his handful with a confiding smile. A dubious nod satisfied him, and presently he started on the play he had devised. He took a feather from the white down and gently shook it free of his fingers, close to the whirl of the wheel. The wind of the swift motion took it, spun it round and around in widening circles, till it floated above like a snow-white moth. Little Rawl's eyes danced, and the now of his small teeth shone in a silent laugh of delight. Another and another of the white tufts was sent whirling round like a winged thing in a spider's web, floating clear at last. Presently the handful failed. Rawls sprawled forward to survey the room and contemplate another journey under the table. His shoulder thrusting forward checked the wheel for an instant. He shifted hastily. The wheel flew on with a jerk, and the thread snapped. Naughty Rawl, snapped the girl. The swiftest wheel stopped also, and the house mistress, Rawl's aunt, leaned forward, and sighting the low curly head, gave a warning against mischief, and sent him off to old Trella's corner. Rawl obeyed, and after a discreet period of obedience, sidled out again down the length of the room, farthest from his aunt's eye. As he slipped in among the men, they looked up to see that their tools might be as far as possible out of the reach of Rawl's hands, and close to their own. Nevertheless, before long he managed to secure a fine chisel and take off his point on the leg of the table. The carver's strong objections to this disconcerted Rawl, who for 5 minutes thereafter effaced himself under the table. During this seclusion he contemplated the many pairs of legs that surrounded him, and almost shut out the light of the fire. How very odd some of the legs were. Some were curved where they should be straight, some were straight where they should be curved, and as Rawl said to himself, they all seemed shrewd in different ways. Some were tucked away modestly under the benches, others were thrust far out under the table and crouching on Rawl's own particular domain. He stretched out his own short legs and regarded them critically, and after comparison favorably, why were not all legs made like his, or like his? These legs, approved by Rawl, were a little apart from the rest. He crawled opposite and again made comparison. His face grew quite solemn as he thought of the innumerable days to come before his legs could be as long and strong. He hoped they would be just like those, his models, as straight as to bone, as curved as to muscle. A few moments later, Swin of the long legs felt a small hand caressing his foot, and looking down, met the upturned eyes of his little cousin Rawl. Rawl, lying on his back, still softly patting and stroking the young man's foot. The child was quiet and happy for a good while. He watched the movement of the strong, deft hands and the shifting of the bright tools. Now and then miniature chips of wood, fluffed off by Swin, fell down upon his face. At last he raised himself very gently, lest a jog should wake impatience in the carver, and crossing his own legs round Swin's ankle, clasping with his arms too, laid his head against the knee. Such act is evidence of a child's most wonderful hero worship. Quite content was Rawl, and more than content when Swin paused a moment to joke and pat his head and pull his curls. Quiet he remained as long as quiescence is possible to limbs as young as his. Swin forgot he was near, hardly noticed when his leg was gently released, and never saw the stealthy abstraction of one of his tools. 10 minutes thereafter was a lamentable wail from low on the floor, raising to the full pitch of Rawl's healthy lungs, for his hand had gashed across, and the copious bleeding terrified him. Then was there soothing and comforting, washing and binding, and a modicum of scolding, till the loud creaking outcry sank into occasional sobs, and the child, tear-stained and subdued, was returned to the chimney corners, settled where Trella nodded. In the reaction after pain and fright, Rawl found that the quiet of that firelit corner was to his mind. Tyre, too, disdained him no longer, but, roused by his sobs, showed all the concern and sympathy that a dog can by licking and wistfully watching. A little shame weighed also upon his spirits. He wished he had not cried out quite so much. He remembered how once Swin had come home with his arm torn down from the shoulder of a dread bear, and how he had never winced nor said a word, though his lips turned white with pain. Poor little Rawl gave another sighing sob over his own faint-hearted shortcomings. The light and motion of the great fire began to tell strange stories to the child, and the wind in the chimney roared a corroborative note down then. The great black mouth of the chimney, impending high over the hearth, received as into a mysterious gulf murky coils of smoke and brightness of aspiring sparks, and beyond, in the dark, high darkness, were mutterings and wailings and strange doings, so that sometimes the smoke rushed back in panic and curled out and up to the roof and condensed itself in invisibility among the rafters. And then the wind would rage after its lost prey and rush around the house, rattling and shrieking at windows and doors. In a lull after one such loud gust, Rawl lifted his head in surprise and listened. A lull had also come to the babble of the talk, and thus could be heard with strained distinctness a sound outside the door. The sound of a child's voice, a child's hands. Open, open, let me in, piped the little voice from low down, lower than the handle, and the latch rattled as though a tiptoe child reached up to it, and soft small knocks were struck. One near the door sprang up and opened it. No one was there. Tyre lifted his head and gave utterance to a growl, loud and prolonged, most disdainful. Schwinn, not able to believe that his ears had deceived him, got up and went to the door. It was a dark night. The clouds were heavy with snow that had fallen pitifully when the wind lulled. Untrodden snow lay up to the porch. There was no sight nor sound of any human being. Swin strained his eyes far and near only to see dark sky, pure snow, and a line of black fir trees on a hill brow. Bowing down before the wind, it must have been the wind, he said, and closed the door. Many faces looked scared. The sound of a child's voice had been so distinct, and the words, "Open, open, let me in." The wind might creak the wood or rattle the latch, but could not speak with a child's voice, nor knock with the soft, plain bows that a plump fist gives. And the strange, unusual howl of the wolfhound was an omen to be feared, be the rest what it might be. Strange things were said by one and another, till the rebuke of the house mistress quelled them into far-off whispers. For a time after there was uneasiness, constraint, and silence. Then the chill fear thawed by degrees, and the babble of talk flowed on again. Yet half an hour later, a very slight noise outside the door sufficed to arrest every hand and every tongue. Every head was raised, every eye fixed in that direction. It is Christian. He is late, said Swin. No, no, this is a feeble shuffle, not a young man's tread. With the sound of uncertain feet came the hard tap tap of a stick against the door and the high-pitched voice of Eld. Open, open, let me in. Again Tyre flung up his head in a doleful howl. Before the echo of the tapping stick and the high voice had fairly died away, Schwinn had sprung up to the door and flung it wide. No one again. He said in a steady voice, though his eyes looked startled as he stared out. He saw the lonely expanse of snow, the clouds swagging low, and between the line of dark fir trees bowing in the wind. He closed the door without a word of comment and recrossed the room. A score of blanched faces were turned to him as though he must be solver in his enigma. He could not be unconscious of this mute eye questioning, and it disturbed his resolute air of composure. He hesitated, glanced toward his mother, the house mistress, then back at the frightened folk, and gravely before them all made the sign of the cross. There was a flutter of hands as the sign was repeated by all, and the dead silence was stirred as by a huge sigh, for the held breath of many was freed, as though the sign gave a magic relief. Even the house mistress was perturbed. She left her wheel and crossed the room to her son and spoke with him for a moment in a low tone that none could overhear. But a moment later her voice was high-pitched and loud, so that all might benefit by her rebuke of the heathen chatter of one of the girls. Perhaps she essayed to silence thus her own misgivings and forebodings. No other voice dared speak now with its natural fullness. Low tones made intermittent murmurs, and now and then silence drifted over the whole room. The handling of tools was as noiseless as might be, and suspended on the instant if the door rattled in a gust of wind. After a time, Schwinn left his work, joined the group nearest the door, and loitered there on the pretense of giving advice and help to the unskillful. A man's tread was heard outside in the porch. Christian, said Swin, and his mother simultaneously. He confidently, she authoritatively to set the checked wheels going again, but Tyre flung up his head with an appalling howl. Open, open, let me in. It was a man's voice, and the door shook and rattled as a man's strength beat against it. Schwinn could feel the planks quivering as on the instant his hand was upon the door, flinging it open to face the blank porch and beyond only snow and sky, the firs aslant in the wind. He stood for a long minute with the open door in his hand. The bitter wind swept in with its icy chill, but a deadlier chill of fear came swifter and seemed to freeze the beating of hearts. Schwinn stepped back to snatch up a great bearskin cloak. Schwinn, where are you going? No farther than the porch, mother, as he stepped out and closed the door. He wrapped himself in the heavy fur and, leaning against the most sheltered wall of the porch, steeled his nerves to face the devil and all his works. No sound of voices came from within. The most distinct sound was the crackle and roar of the fire. It was bitterly cold. His feet grew numb, but he forbore, stamping them into warmth lest the sound should strike panic within. Nor would he leave the porch, nor print a footmark on the untrodden white that declared so absolutely how no human voices or hands could have approached the door since snow fell 2 hours or more ago. When the wind drops, there will be more snow, thought Swin. For the best part of an hour he kept his watch and saw no living thing, heard no unwonted sounds. I will freeze here no longer, he muttered, and re-entered the house. One woman gave a half suppressed scream as his hand was laid on the latch, and then a gasp of relief as Swin came in. No one questioned him, only his mother said in a tone of forced unconcern, "Could you not see Christian coming?" As though she were made anxious only by the absence of her younger son. Hardly had Schwinn stamped near to the fire than clear knocking was heard at the door. Tyre leapt from the hearth, his eyes red as the fire, his fangs showing white in the black jowl, his neck ridged and bristling. Overleaping Rawl ramped at the door, barking furiously. Outside the door, a clear, mellow voice was calling. Tyre's bark made the words undistinguishable. No one offered to steer towards the door before Schwinn. He stalked down the room resolutely, lifted the latch, and swung back the door. A white-robed woman glided in. No wraith, living, beautiful, and young. Tyre leaped upon her. Lithely she balked the sharp fangs with folds of her robe, and snatching from her girdle a small two-edged axe, whirled it up for a blow of defense. Schwinn caught the dog by the collar and dragged him off, yelling and struggling. The stranger stood in the doorway motionless, one foot set forward, one arm flung up, till the house mistress hurried down the room, and Schwinn, relinquishing to the others the furious Tyre, he turned again to close the door and offer excuse for so fierce a greeting. Then she lowered her arms, slung the axe in its place at her waist, loosened the furs about her face, and shook over her shoulders the long white robe, all as it were with the sway of one movement. She was a maiden, tall and very fair. The fashion of her dress was strange, half masculine, yet not unwomanly. A fine fur tunic reaching but little below the knee was all the skirt she wore. Below were the cross-bound shoes and leggings that a hunter wears. A white fur cap was set low upon the brows, and from its edge strips of fur fell lappet-wise about her shoulders. Two of these, at her entrance, had been drawn forward and crossed about her throat, but now loosened and thrust back, left unbidden long plaits of fair hair that lay forward on her shoulder and breast, down to the ivory-studded girdle where the axe gleamed. Schwinn and his mother led the stranger to the hearth without question or sign of curiosity, till she voluntarily told her tale of a long journey to distant kindred, a promised guide unmet, and signals and landmarks mistaken. "Alone?" exclaimed Schwinn in astonishment. "Have you journeyed thus far 100 leagues alone?" She answered yes, with a little smile. "Over the hills and the waste. Why, the folks there are savage and wild as beast." She dropped her hand upon her axe with a laugh of some scorn. "I fear neither man nor beast. Some few fear me." And then she told strange tales of fierce attack and defense, and of the bold huntress life that she had led. Her words came a little slowly and deliberately, as though she spoke in a scarce, unfamiliar tongue. Now and then she hesitated and stopped in a phrase as though for lack of some word. She became the center of a gossip and a group of listeners. The interest she incited dissipated to some degree the dread inspired by the mysterious voices. There was nothing ominous about this young, bright, fair reality, though her aspect was strange. Little Rawl crept near, staring at the stranger with all his might. Unnoticeably, he softly stroked and patted a corner of her soft white robe that reached to the floor in ample folds. He laid his cheek against it caressingly and then edged up close to her knees. "What is your name?" he asked. The stranger's smile and ready answer as she looked down saved Rawl from the rebuke merited by his unmannerly question. "My real name," she said, "would be uncouth to your ears and tongue." The folk of this country have given me another name, and from this, she laid her hand on the fur robe, they call me Whitefell. Little Rawl repeated it to himself, stroking and patting as before. Whitefell, Whitefell. The fair face and soft, beautiful dress pleased Rawl. He knelt up with his eyes on her face and an air of uncertain determination like a robin's on a doorstep, and plumped his elbows onto her lap with a little gasp at his own audacity. Rawl, exclaimed his aunt. But oh, let him be, said Whitefell, smiling and stroking his head, and Rawl stayed. He advanced farther, and panting at his own adventureness in the face of his aunt's authority, climbed up on her knees. Her welcoming arms hindered any protest. He nestled happily, fingering the axe head, the ivory studs in her girdle, the ivory clasp at her throat, the plaits of fair hair, rubbing his head against the softness of her fur-clad shoulder with a child's full confidence in the kindness of her beauty. Whitefell had not uncovered her head, only unknotted the pendant fur loosely behind her neck. Rawl reached up his hand towards it, whispering her name to himself. Whitefell, Whitefell, then slid his arm around her neck and kissed her once, twice. She laughed delightedly and kissed him again. The child plagues you, said Swin. No, indeed, she answered with an earnestness so intense as to seem disproportionate to the occasion. Rawl settled himself again on her lap and began to unwind the bandage bound round his hand. He paused a little when he saw where the blood had soaked through, then went on till his hand was bare and the cut displayed, gaping and long, though only skin deep. He held it upwards. Whitefell, desirous of her pity and sympathy. At sight of it and the blood-stained linen, she drew in her breast suddenly, clasped Rawl to her hand, hard, till he began to struggle. Her face was hidden behind the boy so that none could see its expression. It had lightened up with a most awful glee. Afar beyond the fir grove, beyond the low hill behind, the absent Christian was hastening his return. From daybreak he had been afoot, carrying notice of a bear hunt to all the best hunters of the farms and hamlets that lay within a radius of 12 miles. Nevertheless, having been detained till a late hour, he now broke into a run, going with a long, smooth stride of apparent ease that fast made the miles diminish. He entered the midnight blackness of the fir grove with scarcely slackened pace, though the path was invisible, and passing through into the open again, sighted the farm lying furlong off down the road. Then he sprung out freely and almost on the instant gave one great sideways leap and stood still. There in the snow was the tracks of a great wolf. His hand bent to his knife, his only weapon. He stooped, knelt down to bring his eyes to the level of a beast, and peered about, his teeth set. His heart beat a little harder than the pace of his running insisted on. A solitary wolf, nearly always savage and of large size, is a formidable beast that will not hesitate to attack a single man. This wolf track was the largest Christian had ever seen, and so far as he could judge, recently made. It led from under the fir trees down the slope. Well for him, he thought, was the delay that had so vexed him before. Well for him that he had not passed through the dark fir grove when the danger of jaws lurked there. Going warily, he followed the track. It led down the slope, across a broad, ice-bound stream, along the level beyond, towards making the farm. A less precise knowledge had doubted and guessed that there might have come straying big tire on his like, but Christian was sure, knowing better than to mistake between footmarks of his dog and a wolf. Straight on and straight on towards the farm led the tracks. Surprised and anxious grew Christian that a prowling wolf should dare so near. He drew his knife and pressed on more hastily, more keen-eyed. Oh, that Tyre were with him. Straight on, even to the very door where the snow failed. His heart seemed to give a great leap and then stop. There the track ended. Nothing lurked in the porch, and there was no sign of return. The firs stood straight against the sky, and the clouds lay low, for the wind had fallen, and a few snowflakes came drifting down. In a horror of surprise, Christian stood dazed a moment. Then he lifted the latch and went in. His glance took in all the old familiar forms and faces, and with them that of the stranger, fur-clad and beautiful. The awful truth flashed upon him. He knew what she was. Only a few were startled by the rattle of the latch as he entered. The room was filled with bustle and movement, for it was the supper hour, when all tools were laid aside and trestles and tables shifted. Christian had no knowledge of what he said and did. He moved and spoke mechanically, half thinking that soon he must wake from this horrible dream. Schwinn and his mother supposed him to be cold and dead tired, and spread all unnecessary questions. And he found himself seated beside the hearth, opposite that dreadful thing that looked like a beautiful girl, watching her every movement, curdling with horror to see her fondle the child raw. Schwinn stood near them both, intent upon Whitefell also, but how differently! She seemed unconscious of the gaze of both, neither aware of the chill dread in the eyes of Christian, nor of Schwinn's warm admiration. These two brothers, who were twins, contrasted greatly, despite their striking likeness. They were alike in regular profile, fair brown hair, deep blue eyes, but Schwinn's features were perfect as a young god's, while Christian showed faulty details. Thus the line of his mouth was set too straight, his eyes shelved too deeply back, and the contour of the face flowed in less generous curves than Schwinn's. Their height was the same, but Christian was too slender for perfect proportion, while Schwinn's well-bit knit frame, broad shoulders, and muscular arms made him preeminently for manly beauty as well as for strength. As a hunter, Schwinn was without rival. As a fisherman, without rival. All the countryside acknowledged him to be the best wrestler, the best rider, dancer, and singer. Only in speed could he be surpassed, and that only by his younger brother. All others Schwinn could distance fairly, but Christian could outrun him easily. As he could keep pace with Schwinn's most restless burst, and laugh and talk the while, Christian took little pride in his fleetness of foot, counting on Schwinn's legs to be the least worthy of his members. He had no envy of his brother's athletic superiority, though to several feats he had made a moderate second. He loved as only a twin can love, proud of all that Schwinn did, content with all that Schwinn was, humbly content also that his own great love should not be so exceedingly returned, since he knew himself to be so far less love-worthy. Christian dared not, in the midst of women and children, launch the horror that he knew into words. He waited to consult his brother, but Schwinn did not or would not notice the signal he made, and he kept his face always turned out towards Whitefell. Christian drew away from the hearth, unable to remain passive with that dread upon him. "Where's Tyre?" he said suddenly, then catching sight of the dog in a distant corner. "Why is he chained there?" "He flew at the stranger," one answered. Christian's eyes glowered. Yes, he said interrogatively. He was within an ace of having his brains knocked out. What, Tyre? Yes, she was nimbly up to that little axe she has at her waist. It was well for old Tyre that his master throttled him back. Christian went without a word to the corner where Tyre was chained. The dog rose up to meet him as piteously and indignantly as a dumb beast can. He stroked the black head. Good Tyre, brave dog. They knew, they only, and the man and the dumb dog had comforted each other. Christian's eyes turned again toward White Fell, Tyre's also, and he strained against the length of the chain. Christian's hand lay on the dog's neck, and he felt it ridge and bristle with the quivering of impotent fury. Then he began to quiver in like manner, with a fury born of reason, not instinct, as important morally as was Tyre physically. Oh, the woman's form that he dared not touch, anything but that. And he, with Tyre, would be free to kill or be killed. Then he returned to ask fresh questions. How long has the stranger been here? She came about a half an hour before you. Who opened the door to her? Schwinn, no one else dared. The tone of the answer was mysterious. Why? Queried Christian. Has anything strange happened? Please tell me. For answer, he was told in a low undertone of the summons at the door 3 times repeated without human agency, and of Tyre's ominous howls, and of Swinn's fruitless watch. Christian turned towards his brother in a torment of impatience for a word apart. The board was spread, and Swinn was leading White Fell to the guest's place. This was more awful. She would break bread with them under the roof tree. He started forward and touching Swinn's arm, whispered in urgent entreaty. Swinn stared and shook his head in angry impatience. Thereupon Christian would take no morsel of food. His opportunity came at last. White Fell questioned of the landmarks of the country and of one Cairn Hill, which was an appointment place and a meeting place at which she was due that night. The house mistress and Swinn both exclaimed. It's 3 long miles away, said Swinn, with no place for shelter but a wretched hut. Stay with us this night, and I will show you the way tomorrow. Whitefell seemed to hesitate. 3 miles, she said. I should be able to see or hear a signal. I will look out, said Swinn. Then if there is no signal, you must not leave us. He went to the door. Christian rose silently and followed him out. Swinn, do you know what she is? Swinn, surprised at the vehement grasp and low, hoarse voice, made answer. She? Who? Whitefell? Yes, she's the most beautiful girl I've ever seen. That's what she is. She's a werewolf, Schwinn. Schwinn burst out laughing. Are you mad? No. Here, see for yourself. Christian drew him out of the porch, pointing to the snow where the footmarks had been, for now there was not. Snow was falling fast, and every hint was blotted out. Well, asked Schwinn, what? Had you come when I signed to you, you would have seen for yourself. Seen what? The footprints of a wolf leading up to the front door, none leading away. It was impossible not to be startled by the tone alone, though it was hardly above a whisper. Schwinn eyed his brother anxiously, but in the darkness could make nothing of his face. Then he laid his hands kindly and reassuringly on Christian's shoulders and felt how he was quivering with excitement and horror. No sometimes one sees strange things, he said. When the cold has gotten into the brain behind the eyes, you came in cold and worn out. No, interrupted Christian. I saw the track first on the brow of the slope, and I followed it down right here to the door. This is no delusion." Schwinn in his heart felt positive that it was. Christian was given to daydreams and strange fancies, though never had he been possessed with so mad a notion as this before. "Don't you believe me?" said Christian. "You must. I swear it's the same truth. Are you blind? Why, even Tyre knows." "Yes, you will be clearer headed tomorrow after a night's rest. Then come to, if you will, with White Fell to the hill, Karen, and if you have doubts still, watch and follow, and see what footprints she leaves." Galled by Schwinn's evident contempt, Christian turned abruptly to the door. Schwinn caught him back. "What now, Christian? What are you going to do?" "You do not believe me, my mother shall." Schwinn's grasp tightened. "You shall not tell her," he said authoritatively. Customarily, Christian was so docile to his brother's mastery that it was now a surprising thing when he wrenched himself free vigorously and said as determinedly as Schwinn, "She shall know." But Schwinn was near the door and would not let him pass. "There has been scare enough for one night already. If this notion of yours will keep, broach it tomorrow, Christian." But Christian would not yield. "Women are so easily scared," pursued Schwinn, "and are ready to believe any folly without shadow of proof. Be a man, Christian, and fight this notion of a werewolf by yourself." "If you would just believe me," said Christian. "I believe you to be a fool," said Schwinn, losing patience. "Another who was not your brother might believe you to be a knave, and guess that you had transformed White Fell into a werewolf because she smiled more readily on me than you." The gist was not without foundation, for the grace of White Wolf's bright looks had been bestowed on him. On Christian, never a whit. Schwinn's coxcombry was always frank and most unforgivable, and not without fair color. "If you want an ally," continued Schwinn, "confide in old Trella. Out of her stories of wisdom, if her memory holds good, she can instruct you in the orthodox manner of tackling a werewolf. If I remember aright, you should watch the unsuspected person until midnight, and then when the beast's form must be resumed and retained ever after, if a human eye sees the change, or better still, sprinkle hands and feet with holy water, which is certain death. Oh, never fear, but old Trella will be equal to the occasion in wives' tales." Schwinn's contempt was no longer good humored. Some touch of irritation or resentment at this monstrous doubt of White Fell, but Christian was too deeply distressed to take offense. "You speak of them as old wives' tales, but if you had seen the proof I've seen, you would be ready at least to wish them true, if not also to put them to rest and to a test." "Well," said Schwinn with a laugh that had a little sneer in it, "just put them to the test. I will not object to that, if you'll only keep your notions to yourself. Now, Christian, give me your word for silence, or we'll freeze here no longer." Christian remained silent. Schwinn put his hands on his shoulders again and vainly tried to see his face in the darkness. "We have never quarreled yet, Christian." "I have never quarreled," returned the other, aware of the first time that this dictatorial brother had sometimes offered occasion for quarrel, but he had not risen to it. "Well," said Schwinn emphatically, "if you speak against White Fell to any other, as tonight you have spoken to me, we shall have a problem." He delivered the words like an ultimatum, turned sharp around, and re-entered the house. Christian, more fearful and wretched than before, followed. Snow is falling fast. Not a single light is to be seen. Whitefell's eyes passed over Christian without apparent notice and turned bright and shining upon Schwinn. Nor any signal to be heard, she queried. Did you not hear the sound of a sea horn? I saw nothing and heard nothing, and signal or no signal, the heavy snow would keep you here perforce. She smiled her thanks beautifully, and Christian's heart sank like lead with a dreadful foreboding as he noted what a light was kindled in Swin's eyes by her smile.